Good evening. I guess you all can hear me without this. I have a pretty loud voice. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. I am Vivian Fisher, Deputy Director for Public Services at the Central location. This evening, I am pleased to introduce our guests, author Joshua Clark Davis, and moderator, Senator Emerita Jill P. Carter. Joshua Clark Davis is an accomplished author and educator in the field of creative writing. He is Associate Professor of History at the University of Baltimore. He has published various works in numerous literary journals and anthologies. He is the author of From Head Shops to Whole Foods and the co-editor of Baltimore Revisited. And he has written for The Nation, Slate, Jacobin, and The Atlantic. Senator Emerita Jill P. Carter, a Baltimore native, is a renowned civil rights attorney and Maryland State Senator who has dedicated her career to advocating for justice and equality. As the daughter of the late civil rights activist Walter P. Carter, her path has been shaped by a legacy of activism and community service. In 2003, she was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates, representing Baltimore's 41st Legislative District, and in 2018, Carter was appointed to the Maryland State Senate and later elected to continue representing the 41st District. In December 2024, Governor Wes Moore appointed Carter to the Maryland State Board of Contract Appeals, and she resigned from the Senate in January 2025 to take on this new role. Please give a warm welcome to Joshua Clark Davis and Jill P. Carter, who will discuss Davis's latest work, Police Against the Movement.
Okay. Oh. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone that is attending physically tonight, as well as those that are looking online. I'm excited and really honored to have been selected by Professor, historian, author Joshua Clark Davis to do this interview. Usually they pick people who are like real interviewers. And this is something I'm very excited about doing. I won't take too long with my introductory comments, but I think it's so important that in reading this book, I felt like, where has this book been all of my life? As a person who advocated strongly in Maryland and the Maryland legislature for years, more than a decade, for police reform, I didn't realize how systemic police resistance has been throughout history and how difficult it's been to make any advances. I got from this book the comfort in seeing that it's not always the violence that's the worst thing, it's the lies that are the worst thing. And so I'm thankful to you for this book and for including me tonight. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is a nice turnout for a cold December night. I think it is. And I'm going to do a few quick acknowledgments first. I really want to thank you, Senator Emerita Carter. I had this idea for a long time that you would be a great interlocutor for this event. You know, several years before I even finished the book, we did a great event several years ago. We were just talking about back in the Zoom-only era. Some of you were there. I think you were there, yeah. And it was Senator Carter. It was Eddie Conway, former Black Panther, or I shouldn't say former because that's a lifelong thing. And it was Raleigh Hayes from Organizing Black. That was 2021. But, you know, I really wanted to have Senator Emerita Carter here because she was at the forefront of trying to change policing in this state. I mean, just really. And, you know, one of the few people in our elected bodies in this state who really wanted to challenge a lot of some of the things that police were doing in our state, and got a lot of pushback for it, but got some real legislative victories. And we have things in this state like Anton's Law, and we got rid of that so-called law enforcement Bill of Rights, a lot because of you, and I'm guessing because of your very hard work and just willingness to not give up and to not let some of these people kind of, just do sound bites after 2020 and not really change anything. So that was really why I wanted to have you up here. I wanted to thank you for that. And, you now have left the Senate. Everyone deserves to have a life. You don't have to drive to Annapolis in the coldest winter months. So, hopefully you're getting to stick around Baltimore some more while serving our state. I'll say just a few other quick shout outs. Also, Senator Emerita Carter is an alumna of the University of Baltimore. How many University of Baltimore alums or employees or current students do we have in here right now? We say, that's a good turnout. Okay, thank you all for coming. And some of you are current, some of you are former students, some history grads, some archivists, folks who are working in the Second Chance program. I just drove here tonight from Jessup Correctional Institution, where I was teaching a history class through our Second Chance program there. And that's just an outstanding program. I mean, a few other really quick acknowledgments. I want to thank some friends who came here. I saw my wife, Jessica Douglas, in the back, who's an outstanding archivist who was educating me a lot on all kinds of things, including research mistakes I was making at the beginning, because legal research is very hard, court research, police research. I wanted to shout out a few employees here, also Sophia, who greeted us, Sean, who's doing AV, who I know from other channels throughout town. And I was going to say this briefly, maybe I'm beyond brief now, but I wrote this book literally in my office at home. I wrote it a bit at work, although that's kind of a hard place to hide, but I wrote it a lot at the Waverly branch of our Enoch Pratt Library. And I used these areas called the quiet rooms, which sounds like a punishment, like you're being sent in the corner, but you reserve the room for 2 hours. You go sit in a glass cube and the world is yours, and for those 2 hours. And I was going to shout out some of those people very quickly, because the folks at the Waverly branch are always checking me in and out of those rooms. So I had the names written down. It was very quickly Neelam Prasad, Lolita Little Staten, it was Mr. Cook, it was Jesse, and I had another name that I forgot, but I just wanted to thank them because they have brought me into that room. I've done a lot of hours there doing this work. That's the beginning. That's the acknowledgments. Thank you for indulging me.
So I'm going to dig in with questions, so you're now on the hot seat. And I'm sure you'll do fine with all of the answers, because this book is so well researched. It's pretty amazing. This book shows us that police, we've all seen, those of us that weren't even around during the civil rights movement, we've all seen the footage, and we see the peaceful protests that are have police around with tear gas and other things like that. But I believe that the perception most of us have had is that police were reacting to a civil rights movement, not strategically deployed to sabotage it. What is the single biggest misunderstanding that Americans still have about the role of police during the civil rights movement?
So we're just going to start with a big one. The single biggest misunderstanding, I think, this is kind of two-part. One is that they attacked the civil rights movement through physical violence only, and that the work of surveillance and infiltration and defamation and character assassination was basically left to the federal authorities, that it's basically this J. Edgar Hoover versus Martin Luther King narrative, which is important and fascinating, and not to minimize the damage that the FBI did to King, but the story of state repression of the civil rights movement has been narrowed to that in a way that is just very misleading. That's what I would say the biggest misconception about the police is. The flip side, I would say, is the biggest misconception about the civil rights movement and police is that the civil rights movement suffered police violence, endured it, just took it, and did not offer a fight against it, a protest. Just this constant screening of the iconic footage from, black children protesting, being attacked in Birmingham, or the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, not to minimize that at all, but that the civil rights movement suffered police violence, and the misconception leaves out the fact that it also fought that violence and also recognized that it wasn't just physical, but it was also legal and technological and surveillance and so on and so forth.
That's true, and I think one of the things that your book makes clear is that the biggest threat often wasn't violence, it was the lies and the propaganda that went along with it. And as you said, the character assassination. Many of us know about the FBI, but we know much less about local police espionage and sabotage. Your book starts off talking about the Red Squads, which was something that I might have known but forgot about, but your book highlights that at the beginning. Can you talk about what local police departments do that has been even more damaging than COINTELPRO in some ways?
Yeah, so I'm sure most people in the room have heard of COINTELPRO, which was the FBI's counterintelligence program, most notoriously against so-called black extremists, launched in 1967. The FBI was doing some of that stuff earlier, but really the Red Squads were political intelligence units inside police departments all over the country. New York had the biggest one, Chicago had a big one, Baltimore had one. In the 60s, it was called the Inspectional Services Division, the ISD. These, you could kind of think of them as little FBIs. They were inside police departments, secretive political intelligence divisions that, maybe they handled organized crime as well, but they were very frequently focused on political activists. The oldest ones, New York and Chicago, are even older than the FBI itself. They're called Red Squads because originally they went after communists and also anarchists, and kind of their size and activity fluctuated over the decades. And one thing that happened, with the Red Scare and the anti-communist hysteria after World War II, the Communist Party in the US was almost extinguished. By like the late 50s, it was almost nothing. It was very, very little. And the emergence of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s gave these Red Squads kind of a new reason to live. And in many cities, those Red Squads had been shut down or they had been kind of shrunk. And then in city after city in the 60s, they were kind of revived, expanded, intensified, redirected to do what we could call like disruption, direct infiltration. And so that, to me, it's not that people hadn't written about the Red Squads before, but they hadn't written about them really intensively in terms of what did they do with the civil rights movement, and in how in many ways did they precede and anticipate COINTELPRO, and in some ways even do things worse than COINTELPRO. I mean, these might seem like fine distinctions, but like the FBI, for example, never wanted to send its own agents undercover into activist groups. They wanted to contract that work out and pay an informant, really because J. Edgar Hoover was afraid if one of our agents gets caught, that's going to be really embarrassing. But you had police departments across the country who basically assigned police officers to play the role of activists, infiltrate groups, disrupt, prod into dangerous schemes, so on and so forth. So to me, that's at the heart of this book, the work of Red Squads to try to go after civil rights activists and to, in some ways, do what the FBI was doing, but sometimes earlier, sometimes even more dangerously.
I think that's interesting, and it resonated with me because in our time, we know of specialized squads and specialized units within police departments that have had a lot of power. Some of us know Gun Trace Task Force here in Baltimore, and they've been given throughout. They are an extension I learned from your book of squads that have always existed to be resistant. In your research, you uncover, so I was happy to read, see Ella Baker get her props and to read about Reverend Shuttlesworth and Rosa Parks and those names that we know. But you also uncover activists that push back brilliantly, sometimes invisibly, against police infiltration and repression. Can you talk about some of those unsung heroes of that counter-surveillance resistance and what tactics they used that modern movements should revive?
Very good question. So I guess I wouldn't say these were invisible, but at first one thing that was really fascinating to me is the way in which the sit-in tactic, right? Like the tactics that were being used on buses and in cafeterias and public transit, that two groups in particular in the civil rights movement, well, really the group, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, really took those tactics and started using them against racist policing. They did pickets outside of police stations. They literally did sit-ins inside police stations. They took over bridges. They took over roads. So that to me was very important. That was happening all over the country. And this group CORE, there's kind of like four major civil rights groups that we think of: NAACP, which I'm sure people know, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's organization, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that's John Lewis and Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Judy Richardson, folks like that. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, is kind of the least remembered. And this is another reason why I wanted to have Senator Emerita Carter, because of her father, and Walter P. Carter, who was very active in CORE in Baltimore. And CORE was kind of unusual because, like the NAACP, it was a member organization. It had chapters like all over the country, but it also was more radical. So it was kind of more like SNCC in that regard. It was younger, but kind of invisible. One thing that really drew me in was CORE of all the civil rights organizations. It's like the terrible footage of the Birmingham police turning fire hoses and attack dogs onto the young children in Birmingham in May 1963, dramatically just horrified not only the United States but the world. And it was, we could think of it as the George Floyd moment of the 1960s. And the way different civil rights groups responded to it was very different. King and the SCLC kind of thought, well, this helped us get our story out. We don't want to put children in harm's way, but at the same time, some Americans and some white people are so myopic that nothing less than people being brutally attacked on TV will wake them up. But CORE said, we need to do more. We need to take this police violence movement, or we need to take police violence and make it something the movement fights. It needs to be one of our signature issues. It can't just be desegregation or even just housing or schools. Police violence needs to be one of our main issues. There was a guy in Boston in CORE named Alan Gartner who wrote a report in the wake of the Birmingham fiasco, brutalities. Well, he was studying Boston, this guy Alan Gartner, and he said it's not just about police violence. We should call it police malpractice, because there is a whole total failure of duty that characterizes the way that police in the United States were treating people of color and also treating movements. And he kind of was mapping out for CORE, there's different ways police can harm people and do violence. And so to me, that was really powerful, this concept of police malpractice. And he was a pretty obscure guy, like I think within CORE he was known, but they were kind of intellectually mapping out ideas about state violence that were way ahead of not only most Americans, but most of the civil rights movement.
Thank you. I think that's still ahead. And, as I said, as we've recently gone through this movement here in Maryland and across the country, much of it in the wake of George Floyd, it reminds me of the George Floyd moment, that in Maryland, from at least the time of the Freddie Gray killing, we were well aware of police as an issue, as something in need of a change, but it took the George Floyd movement. And I always say that, because I was part of the Democratic caucus at the time, so I knew this happened, that it was actually the polling of white people in Maryland who said we don't want police to keep killing black people that really caused the legislature to change its view. But back to my notes. I think you've already kind of touched on this, but so the state's repression was massive, organized, and often violent, but given what you've uncovered, how did the movement survive at all? What made it resilient despite sabotage?
Another not easy question, but a very good one. How did it survive? I think what especially folks in CORE and SNCC were doing by 1963, 1964, first of all, was realizing that they had to watch the police and that they had to, not just figuratively, but had to observe them, had to keep their eyes on them, had to retain radical attorneys, right? And you know, the NAACP has done like tremendous legal work over the decades, but for groups like SNCC and CORE, by the middle of the 60s, they were often saying like the NAACP is a little too timid to defend us sometimes. And so they were pushing it even further and working with attorneys aligned with the group that's still active nationally, the National Lawyers Guild. And so for one, it was like getting more kind of movement-oriented attorneys who kind of lawyers who think as activists, not just as lawyers who defend activists. So that was one thing. Another thing is civil rights activists literally started watching the police. And so the Black Panther Party, who kind of shows up in the tail end of my book, you know, did incredible work around police violence and kind of put it at the center of their work. And I think this book, I started writing it in 2017, and part of why I wrote it was that a lot of people in the media were saying Black Lives Matter, which was a new movement, is basically continuing the work of the civil rights movement. But the media was saying BLM is picking up where the civil rights movement ended. BLM is doing the work the civil rights movement could not do. I'm not saying BLM said that, but many journalists were saying BLM starts where the civil rights movement ended. And I really wanted to know if that was true. I had a feeling that's probably not true, but I was surprised by how little was written about the civil rights movement's work against policing. And so that was kind of the opening question of this book that got me researching. But, you know, the most historically informed media, when they were talking about BLM, they might connect it to the work of the Panthers and say, all right, the Panthers were talking about police violence. The Panthers had police patrols where they went out and watched them. It was amazing to me to learn that there were activists both in CORE and SNCC who were doing police patrols to watch police on the street in places like Seattle and LA more than a year before the Panthers were founded. So that's not to minimize what the Panthers did, but the Panthers over time, if you listen to them carefully, would acknowledge, yeah, there's some good things that were coming out of the civil rights movement that we actually were inspired by. And so that was another way of survival, and I think yet another probably was just making state violence an issue, right? And kind of the civil rights movement, at least SNCC and CORE, pushing that to the forefront and saying police violence isn't just something that we have to deal with, it's something that is part and parcel of American racism, and it's part and parcel of what this movement's fighting. And it's not just Southern, it's also Northern, it's in the cities. And so I think that the groups that were kind of shifting that way after Birmingham in '63, they're kind of coming up with new ways to try to protect themselves. And I mean, another way, not to belabor this, but I think some of you may know this book by Charlie Cobb, veteran of SNCC. It's called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. And a basic lesson of it is there was a lot of people in the civil rights movement who carried guns. And they didn't use them very often, but they used them so they didn't get killed. And even Dr. King, the apostle of nonviolence, he had multiple bodyguards around him at lots of times with guns. And, you know, when they're going to places like rural Mississippi and people are literally being killed, those guns were a deterrent to being killed. So that's kind of another thing. I don't write a lot about that, but that is a big part of what you're talking about.
Thank you. You know, it's really hard for me to narrow down questions because this book is so complex and it talks about our history from basically the past almost 100 years. But one of the things that also resonated with me, and you've touched on a little bit, is that the resistance of law enforcement that's been consistent throughout our country's history to any kind of civil rights or racial justice shows itself in same and different ways. And so, at the very beginning of my political career in 2003, I came into a lot of problems because of fighting against, at that time, Mayor Martin O'Malley's illegal arrest policies. And believe this or not, I know I should have known this, and I maybe intellectually knew it but forgot. I was surprised to read in your book that that's been a common thing, pretextual arrest, including of legislators or lawmakers that happened, you know, over the course of time. How do we do a better job, other than reading your book, of informing people that what we are experiencing is not an anomaly, but it's something that has happened throughout history in different forms and in different ways?
Yes. And also, just to be fair, I'm learning about all these questions in real time, so this is not staged. And it's, yeah. And we can say, you know, part of what's hard about asking questions about this book also is that it's kind of too damn long. I mean, I meant to write a shorter book, and so
You couldn't, a lot to say.
yeah, it was even going to be longer, and that my editor, who's an incredible editor, was like, you need to cut like 30,000 words. But okay, how to make this longer history more apparent to people? I think, I mean, one of the things that again, this is not to say my book will do this at all, but I think I didn't realize until I got to the end of the book that this book was a lot about memory and about memory of the civil rights movement and kind of calling for a more honest conversation about the civil rights movement. I mean, I think we all know that, you know, Dr. King's memory is exploited by any number of people year-round, especially in January. That's not like a secret. I mean, everyone claims to love I Have a Dream. But the conversation in our country about the police and civil rights movement is almost non-existent. I mean, again, it is a conversation about police in Alabama. If there's any memories at all, it's about the Birmingham police, the Selma police. It's not about this profession all over the country that was very determined to stop this movement. And so how do we get people more open to thinking about that? I mean, I think I didn't also know when I was writing this book where we would be in 2025. I mean, it's just been a total roller coaster. So when I started this in 2017, it's like, oh, there's this new movement, BLM. And then 3 years later, when I'm still writing it, it's like, wow, this movement is, you know, one of the largest movements in world history. And then 2 years later, it's like, oh, so now this movement is really being pushed back. And now 2025, it's not that BLM has gone away, but the way in which people are really attacking political protest as, you know, taking peaceful political protest and mischaracterizing it as violence, I think is like a lot of what's going on in 2025. And so I don't know if this answers your question, but when you have folks, for example, who fortunately are pushing back against ICE, for example, or are speaking out even at the threat of losing their jobs or harassment. I mean, I think that's what hopefully people are going to continue to do, because we're in this moment right now where, I was just reading about 2 student magazines at the University of Alabama. One is just a magazine for women, and one is just a magazine for black students. And the university just shut them down in the last week, arguing that a federal memo around Title IX claims that any programs that like single out a certain type of student are illegal. And so we just can't really get lazy about allowing that to happen. I don't know, I'm meandering a little bit, but I think it's just right now there's a lot of people who want to criminalize nonviolent political speech in a way that is very dangerous, and that fortunately people are pushing back in a way that is essential, because if you don't push back, then there's basically nothing left.
In all of the research that you did, what's the most shocking form of sabotage that you discovered? What story made you say, people have to know this? This is amazing.
So I did try to make this a narrative-driven book. It has a lot of characters. It has, I hope, some suspense. It's not like, the 10-episode Netflix cliffhanger, but there are some shockers in there. And one of the ones that was that really captivated me was in 1964, the New York Police Department's Red Squad sent 2 police officers in to infiltrate black activist groups. And one of them was a guy named Gene Roberts, who ended up serving as Malcolm X's bodyguard. And when Malcolm X was killed, there were pictures that ran in Life magazine and show a bloodied Malcolm X, and his bodyguard is kneeling over him, and that bodyguard is Gene Roberts. I didn't discover that, but what I did discover is that this other guy, Ray Wood, who I did not discover that person, but what I learned is that Ray Wood and Gene Roberts were hired on the same day. Ray Wood was sent into a group. It was the Bronx chapter of CORE, and it was kind of the group in CORE, probably in the country, that was most actively pushing against police violence. And Ray Wood was supposed to target this guy named Herb Callender, who was had already been condemned by the NYPD commissioner. Ray Wood basically talked Herb Callender and other activists into performing a citizen's arrest on the mayor of New York, Robert Wagner. And a citizen's arrest was legally permissible in New York at the time. But as you can guess, when you try to arrest the mayor, it's not going to go well. So that was just kind of outlandish, and that landed Herb Callender in the psychiatric ward at Bellevue Hospital for like a week or 10 days. But the kicker, if I can call it that, and this is a little bit of a long story, but this guy Ray Wood was then sent into other activist groups, and he penetrated this very small group called the Black Liberation Front, and he basically encouraged them to try to blow up the Statue of Liberty. And it's never known who came up with the idea, but Ray Wood, working with the NYPD, did things like gave them the Army manual for explosives, gave them gasoline, rented a car with NYPD funds, took one of the activists up to Canada to try to buy dynamite, just along the way, again and again and again, just encouraged it. Let's blow it up, let's blow it up, let's blow it up. And then eventually the FBI got involved and the NYPD arrested these activists. And they went to prison. Like, the story was all over the front page of not only New York papers, but papers worldwide. And this guy, Ray Wood, was held up as like a hero. And they tried a entrapment defense, but the judge just wasn't buying it. But it was like such an outlandish idea that these guys would blow up the Statue of Liberty, and you have this cop pretending to be an activist the whole time and providing material support to do damage. I mean, they literally were handling dynamite, and the cop told one of the activists, "Oh, just leave the dynamite in the community garden outside of the apartment building. I'll pick it up." Like extremely dangerous things that could have killed people, and people didn't. It's like that's shocking, but also the reaction to it was people were very, very accepting of it. And those 3 guys went to prison, you know, maybe for 18 months, but still their lives were really kind of really hurt.
You know, it's interesting. I find that shocking, but not altogether different from today. Police departments and law enforcement still position themselves as protectors as they did in the civil rights era. Even to the point of, like in that example, of putting people in harm's way to ensure that they are stopping any type of black organization or black movement. Can you talk about why that's been so important to law enforcement, and why have the false narratives been so successful to some extent?
I mean, one thing I saw in this book, and it didn't shock me, but it did surprise me how often it was true, is that civil rights activists who explicitly denounced police violence and protested it were particular targets of police. It's kind of like police treated them even more harshly. And so obviously police who saw activists as criticizing them, you know, responded in kind. But I think the bigger thing is, and I think this is kind of what some people are trying to do today against, you know, activists who are watching ICE, patrolling, recording, is to try to perpetuate this narrative that if you question or criticize or protest law enforcement, that you are basically indulging in the most dangerous acts of anti-government. I mean, the current administration says domestic terrorism. In the 1940s and 50s, one of the things that scared a lot of black activist groups like the NAACP off of protesting police violence was the charges of being communist. And it was kind of basically this, it wasn't just that protesting was communist or civil rights work was communist, but it was this line of thought that if you are protesting the police, then you are protesting the government, you are protesting the state, you are trying to destabilize the American state. And there's echoes of that today, I think, in the way people are discussing protesters today as terrorists. And that's, I think, the framing has changed, but it's basically a way of saying this type of political speech is so dangerous that it is anti-government and it deserves to be squashed.
Why are lawmakers so afraid to speak the truth in the face of these kinds of false narratives?
Well, that question, I feel like you might have a few insights that I don't have, not from your experience.
It came up. Well, it's been something that's been very troubling to me, and everything that I read and what you've just talked about reminded me a lot of in 2021, the Maryland General Assembly finally passed long overdue police reforms with repealing law enforcement officer Bill of Rights and Anton's Law. I'd been a longtime advocate of that. No leader in the General Assembly, no chair of anything. Yet law enforcement created a narrative that somehow I was responsible for crime, juvenile crime, and stopped them from talking to kids. And it was a completely false narrative, and I was flabbergasted that, one, people couldn't see through it and they believed it, but also that my colleagues in the legislature were all quiet about it.
Yeah, some of them folded. I mean, that was, without naming names, it has been disappointing, to say the least, to see after some of those really important laws that you helped get passed in 2021, how some really maybe spineless, somewhat unprincipled elected officials then kind of within a year, 18 months, started listening too much to Fox 45 and getting literally trying to undo, and did undo some of that stuff, right? Some of that stuff literally was legislatively undone, others not. But to see kind of who spoke out, who defended these things, like why is it that this law that was passed in 2021, why was it then a year later no longer positive because of, I don't know, this and that, and what certain judges said or what certain business owners in Fells Point said. But I'm digressing. Why are legislators so scared? Okay, yes, I have some good. Yes, well, today, first of all, they're supposed to be representing the government, and so if someone is questioning the government, then they feel like they're being questioned or attacked. Police departments are powerful. Police unions are even more powerful. That's a more recent dynamic. Like the really powerful police unions dynamic was not really at play in the 60s. Some of you may know the historian Stuart Schrader, who teaches at Johns Hopkins, and he has a book coming out in April, which is going to be really, I think it's called Police Power or something like that. It's basically about the road to today. How did police departments and police unions get so powerful that they're almost, untouchable, and in many cases seemingly beyond the political control of elected officials? But I think politicians, a lot of them, not generalizing, present company excluded, and you're not even, a legislator anymore, so I can talk freely about all of them. Crime is a really easy way for elected officials to be attacked, as you experienced, and it's even in 2025 being soft on crime. Like if you're not willing to really respond to that creatively or thoughtfully, then you're kind of dead in the water. And so we are lucky because we have some elected officials in this city and in the state who have been pretty creative about saying, well, actually maybe violence interruption might work more effectively than just locking people up. But there are a fair number of elected officials who are not willing to even entertain that thought process. And I think that is why some of them are so reflexively beyond defensive of police and so willing to kind of go after people who question the police.
Thank you. Reading your book took me way back to the 60s and the time that I grew up, which was an amazing time. And so I was just contemplating what this book meant to me. And I don't want to be negative, I'm going to end on a positive note. But I posted on Facebook today, just out of the blue, they got us in a trick bag. Because that's like something they used to say in the 60s. And I remembered it just came to me. And that's how it's easy to feel when you read the consistent, systemic, repeated resistance to any type of progress. So my final question to you is, given everything you've studied, the sabotage, the survival, the evolution of repression, what will it actually take for modern movements to win? Where does victory begin? And what do we need to do now that past movements did not do?
Okay. So you saved the easiest question for last. And so, I also hope, this is like a very serious conversation, but also I hope it's not like a total downer to people, because I do think as dark as some of this stuff is, there are kind of glimmers of possibility. And, I'm not an expert on the law. I'm not an attorney. I don't know how to run a prison. It's not something I'm interested in doing. But I still wanted there to be things in this book that maybe gave some ideas for things to do, and they're kind of modest, but I think that people who are involved in political organizing, they need to have good movement-oriented lawyers, and they need to be very proactive about having someone kind of retained for them. I think that movements and people who are very involved in protest need to get really practiced at research and recording, documenting, and writing their own story. And this is something like the folks in SNCC did a lot. And I mean, they did it all over the place. They had their own newspaper. They had their own publications. They documented. And actually, some of you might have known Stu Wexler, who passed away within the last 9 months, who was a longtime core organizer who came down from New York to Baltimore in the 60s and never left. And he had a very, very interesting story. I interviewed him for this book, and he ended up working for Jim Rouse and just all these things. And one of the things that he said in his interview that really stuck with me, I think I asked him, I was like, why do you think that core is like remembered for the freedom rides and not a whole lot else, to be honest? And SNCC is much better remembered. And he pretty quickly said, I was always envious of SNCC because they realized that they needed to tell their own story and record their own history, and we did not. And CORE is a complicated group. It had like basically like a split and a takeover, and it just went in a totally different direction into the deep end. But I think if you're doing political work and you don't at least record some of it and document it and tell your own stories, then that's a problem. I mean, these are very modest things, but I think they're things that matter. And I think also people have to think about to what degree they want to challenge the state and challenge governments. I mean, even something like public records requests, FOIA requests. I mean, you helped change the law with Anton's law, and it's like these police departments across the state are still, routinely, some of them charging someone $10,000 for a basic records request when there is a shooting of a civilian. But I feel like it may seem small, but it's like if you're doing political work, you have to develop a strategy and a stomach and the experience to do that type of research. And it's trial and error, but like journalists really know how to do it. And it's a skill set for anyone, even if you're not an activist. If you're an attorney, you better know how to do it too. But it's like deciding to what degree and how to challenge a government that is harming people. That's part of the picture. So that's not a solution. That's just like 3 things, and there's probably a list of like 100 more that other people could like articulate better than I could.
You mentioned a solution at the end, or somewhat of a solution, this idea of truth and reconciliation. How plausible is that, and what does that look like?
Right, I didn't even mention that one. Okay, so maybe some of you have heard of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee that basically was like a people's tribunal after apartheid to try to tell the truth of apartheid. And people disagree about what it did, what it achieved, but it was an attempt to tell the truth. And I think that's something that historians are supposed to do, and people in general, and it's hard to do. But, it's unlike, I recommended in this book, we should have a truth commission in this country about how police sabotage the civil rights movement. And I acknowledged it's very unlikely this will happen. But I also said, it doesn't even have to be state-sponsored. It could be like political organizations who basically hold tribunals, hold commissions to try to just publicly air and inventory things that happened. I mean, one of the things I really talk about in the book is just COINTELPRO is kind of a household word, at least if you're, maybe not a household word, but a lot of people know that term. J. Edgar Hoover was a household name, and he still kind of is. The idea that the FBI did harm to these groups is very widely known, but we haven't really had a public reckoning about how police handled the civil rights movement. If you lived through the 70s, you might remember the Church Commission, which probed the CIA and the FBI. We never had anything like that with how police handled the local civil rights movement. And so I think something like that could happen. How likely, I don't know. It's probably not going to be state-sponsored, but I feel like a organization or political groups could stage something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Thank you. I think it takes collaboration, and I'll just say that after the General Assembly passed the police reforms in 2021, they weren't even willing to go back and tweak things like Anton's law to make it work better. But I think that this portion of our program is out of time, and so it's now time to open up for the rest of you. I want to thank you for this opportunity again. And I look forward to hearing your questions if you have any, and especially since Joshua has to answer them.
All right.
Thank you, by the way.
We have about, oh, yes, go, yes. So we have about 10 minutes for your questions, not 10 questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand, I'll pick on you, you'll say your question, and then we'll get you an answer, hopefully. First question is in the front.
Hi, thank you so much, Mr. Davis and Senator Emerita, for this wonderful dialogue. As you mentioned, at least 30,000 words got cut out of this edition of the book. Is there a particular anecdote or narrative or theme that is not in the book that you'd like to share with us?
Okay, that's a good question. Was there a particular anecdote, theme, or question that got cut that I wanted in there that I want to share with you guys? Well, how long do you have? Let me think. I'll say a few things that this is a national book. It goes at different cities. It really looks a lot at New York, LA, Houston, Birmingham, to a lesser degree, Philadelphia, Nashville. I wanted to have more about my hometown of Atlanta. I wanted to have more about Detroit. Atlanta in particular was interesting to me because their police chief was this guy, Herbert Jenkins, who was kind of like the liberal police chief, who actually served on the Warren Commission. And there's a lot of different stories about this, but apparently he was at least somewhat friendly with Daddy King, Dr. King's father. And I wanted to learn more about that relationship, and I didn't get to, but I think I might still do something about that. I mean, even this could be apocryphal, but I think in Coretta Scott King's memoir, she claimed that Police Chief Jenkins at one point tipped off Dr. King about FBI surveillance. But the Atlanta police also spied on and surveilled SNCC all over the place. So it's a very complicated question, but I kind of would have liked to have brought in some more of those types of stories, some other cities. And to be honest, Baltimore, I really wanted to have more in the book, but the Baltimore police records don't appear to exist. And that's true in a lot of cities, so Baltimore's not unique in that way. And there's still stuff out there. And so, I still have an FBI request out for Walter P. Carter, and I've gotten a few files. And, so it was interesting to see, here's the Baltimore County Police Department arrest record for Walter P. Carter when he was protesting at Gwen Oak Amusement Park, So just seeing that, it wasn't like revelatory, but I wanted to have more of Baltimore in there for sure, but couldn't really get the records that I needed.
We'll take this gentleman in the hat.
I was wondering, what do you think are the most really effective legal strategies that activists use to fight back against police during the civil rights movement and during the modern day? What constitutional protections can be used, have been used to fight back against this police violence?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of two-part answer. One is basically taking legal defense and turning it into a movement. Like, for example, what's going on with someone like Kilmar today. I mean, we'll see what happens with him, but just the fact that he's not even still languishing in this secret prison in, was it El Salvador? The fact that he's even not there is a victory, and that his legal defense very quickly transformed from defense work into defense work plus mass movement. That's one thing. That's kind of a general statement. The other one is in the 70s in a lot of cities, activists, civil rights activists, Black Panthers, anti-war activists teamed up and sued police departments and got big collections of records. And I think lawsuits are still an important tool, even if you don't win the case or get a settlement. The mere process of discovery is very, very important for documenting things that will never come to light unless a judge orders them to. Now, that's gotten more complicated apparently because a lot of people don't listen to judges right now, but those are the two kind of strategies that come to mind.
We have time for 2 more questions, and I'm going to take the 2 in the back. So first on my right.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any inkling to pull your research and forward and do something about what's happening part of an activist organization, and we like get a lot of headwinds or whatever, and like we know lawyers can't be trusted, state's attorneys can't be trusted, a lot of judges can't be trusted. So like, how do you like discover when you've been infiltrated by somebody? You know what I'm saying? Like, so like, you can discover it after the fact, you know, but like, what about like when you're in the midst of it, to know you've been infiltrated and you're being sabotaged, like Bill Ferguson putting 2 FOP members on the Judiciary Committee while you were trying to get those laws passed, like that kind of stuff.
There are activists who have written about that, and I wish I could recall some of the names. One of them is by a guy named Brian something. I don't remember his last name. He wrote a book in 1991, 89 that's put out by South End Press. If you looked at it, if you Googled Brian South End Press 1989 police infiltration, you'll get it. There are resources out there, and I don't teach people how to prevent infiltration, but even have a student right now who's maybe working on a grad project along those lines. But you know, this sounds silly, but you should maybe go to Red Emma's and ask them, because I even think they have that. I think they have that book, and they probably have a few other resources along those lines. So that's not the best answer, but that's the realest answer.
He won't tell us what.
Yeah, no, don't even get me started on ChatGPT.
And our last question is the gentleman in the back.
Thanks for a good book. I'm about halfway through it. And the thing that immediately popped to mind was you see these upticks that are usually tied to labor movements and economic change. Did you notice that in your discovery that, like, in particular, racism is universal, but it's usually applied as a local phenomenon. So, like, in these spaces that you were going to, were you noticing, there was changes in labor, and the state was being employed in an extrajudicial way in order to manifest a different economic outcome?
Yeah, great question. And I was going to say thanks to Stephen Ragsdale for asking that. He is, like several of us in the room, a member of our Baltimore City Historical Society Advisory Board. I think I saw Dean, and I saw Aiden, and Jess in the back. I feel like there's even a few more here. But anyways, side note, I think it's third Thursday of the month, January through June, we have a history evening talk at the Village Learning Place, and we have some great talks coming up this January to June. So check those out. Look at our website and our social media. We will be promoting them a lot, but it's once a month and really great historians doing work, and it's all different talks about Baltimore. To the question about labor, yes, excellent question. The Red Squads, a lot of them really grew out of anti-labor work, and some of the earliest policed work against activists was really against union organizers, even things like the Haymarket riot. And in many ways, these Red Squads, their bread and butter for many, many decades was tracking union organizers who they suspected of communism. And so that's not at the heart of this book, but that was the kind of intellectual mindset, the frame of thinking that these Red Squads grew out of, and that was the way that many of these intelligence detectives thought about the civil rights movement. You know, it's, yes, they were racist, but they also had a very particular kind of allergy or distaste for what they saw as political subversion. Again, this is someone who claims they are doing good, but they are actually trying to undermine the American state, the American way of life. And they may say they work for, you know, IWW, or they work for the AFL-CIO, or they work for the SCLC, but it's all the same game. And so, yeah, that mindset of labor radicalism being very dangerous fueled a lot of this work going into the decades ahead. And a lot of these civil rights activists also had connections to labor and lots of union connections. And again, I mentioned the National Lawyers Guild. A lot of them came out of the background of being like labor lawyers. And they were taking that mindset to defending civil rights activists, which was a bit different than the mindset of the NAACP, who was also involved, but in a somewhat different capacity. So, yeah, great question.
Please help me thank tonight's moderator, Jill P. Carter. And tonight's author, Joshua Clark Davis. And so now we're going to get some books signed. Books are still available for purchase at Greedy Reads right outside. You don't have to go too far. We will get some books signed for you if you get a book and you'd like to get it signed. And otherwise, thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your night.